Lease purchase and vendor management. Introduction. In this module, you'll be introduced to the necessary information a successful facilities manager needs to understand and be able to carry out their duties related to lease purchase and vendor management. The topics you'll look at are lease administration, leasehold, things to consider, leaseholder rights, procurement, vendor management. Lease administration. It can often be the case that a facilities manager is in charge of more than one office or campus for the organization. In this case, they need to practice conscientious lease management. To this end, an FM should be familiar with the principles of property development and lease administration. Companies often find themselves in a position where they must become lessors, and in that case, they will need somebody in charge of administering the lease itself, lease administration, and dealing with the particulars of the tenant to ensure that they meet the demands of the lease, property management. Keyword: lessor, a person or organization that leases or lets property to another. Leasehold. Owning a leasehold means you have bought the right to occupy a property for a certain number of years. In the UK, it's usually 99 plus. It does not mean you own the property. When signing a leasehold, remember the following. The length of occupancy should be stipulated in the contract. When a lease term reaches 0, the landlord can reclaim the property. It is possible to renew if the lease has more than 80 years remaining. The lease is a legally binding contract. This contract should set out the rights and responsibilities of both parties. Things to consider. Before buying a leasehold, there are several significant factors that an FM and a planning team need to keep in mind. How much does it cost? Because a leasehold is a long-term investment with financial responsibilities spanning years that need to be accounted for, it's important to consider the future of the investment. Ground rent. Sometimes it is written into a contract that a leaseholder must pay a sum to the landlord. This can change depending on the property and will be stipulated in the lease. Service charge. Repairs, gardening, cleaning common areas, building insurance, and other costs incurred by services provided to the leaseholder need to be considered. Reserve or sinking fund. Sometimes you are required to pay into a pot to contribute to future services such as major repairs. This is not always written into the contract and is decided by the landlord. Additional costs. There are some administration charges that may apply relating to making certain documentation available, making alterations, delayed rent payments, or breaches of contract. Potential future costs. It's almost inevitable that legal or surveyor fees will be incurred relating to lease extension or freehold purchase. Leaseholder rights. Though it is recommended that you seek legal and financial counsel before actioning your rights as a leaseholder, it's important to be familiar with the options you are entitled to. You have the right to a summary of costs. Look at invoices and service cost documents, insurance for example. Challenge charges. You can demand the first-tier tribunal rule on certain service or admin charges. Right to manage. You can set up a right to manage company with other leaseholders to manage services. Form a recognized tenants association. You can ally yourself with other leaseholders to represent common interests. Appoint a manager. You can appoint your own managing agent under certain conditions. Extend a lease. Should you satisfy certain conditions, you can extend the lease by 50 years in a house and 90 years in a flat. Buy the freehold. As a group and individual, leaseholders have the right to buy the freehold from its owner. Collectively purchase freehold with other leaseholders. Leaseholders can buy out the freehold as a collective. First refusal. It is illegal for a landlord not to offer the freehold to the leaseholders before third parties. Vary the terms of a lease. With consensus, the lease can be varied at any time. Procurement. Procuring services requires technical, legal, commercial, and logistical acumen to be performed properly, and a facilities manager should be well versed in the basics of these technical activities. To allow bidding parties to accurately price services, the following steps should be taken. Provide a detailed scope of services including the service line, in example catering, service element, in example staff restaurant, and premises, where the work is required. Provide clear service specifications that clearly state the objectives, the service levels, any exclusions, and any specific qualification requirements. Undertake condition surveys and asset registers. Legal and commercial activities. Making sure the procurement process conforms to legal practice is vital. There are various areas that need to be covered by the law during the procurement process, and it's important for an FM to be aware of all of these. Consider, and if necessary, take on legal counsel to ensure due diligence during the procurement procedures. Often there will be dedicated teams for each of the areas that you will be looking at, but as a manager it's vital to maintain an overview of the following: pricing, fixed or variable, or guaranteed maximum or cost plus or pass-through. Limits of liability, obligated damages under the contracted terms. Insurance requirements. It's important to consult specialists in order to get the right level of insurance. This will cover the procurement financially should the supply default and not fulfill the requirement. Indexation. Choose the appropriate pricing index for services, RPI, RPIX, CPI, for example. Continuous improvement. Vis-à-vis service standards and cost reductions. Gain share mechanisms and incentives. Motivation for suppliers to work smarter and cheaper. Performance mechanisms. Achievable service levels and key performance indicator, KPI, analysis. Value testing and benchmarking. Making sure the organization is getting a fair rate based on performance and market conditions. Further legal considerations relating to contracting are: change control, form of contract, contract length, dispute resolution, termination provisions. Procurement process. The actual process is the most crucial part of procurement and involves selecting the right organizations to fulfill the needs stipulated in contracts. If you aren't able to select the right contractors, your projects won't flourish. The procurement process can seem a little overwhelming at first, but once suitable bidders have been identified, it is relatively simple. The process should be as follows: invite bidders to tender. Issue request for proposal or invitation to tender to gather information. Put the bidders through testing to identify the most suitable. Allow enough time for bidders to develop a pitch for your business that responds to your set-out demands. Allow them access to the necessary information to form their bid. Conduct site visits. Perform evaluation. Award contract to the bidder that meets the requirements. Mobilization and transition. Mobilization, the time between contract awarding and commencement, falls into 3 categories. People. This usually means the requisite transition of staff to fulfill the contract. Equipment. Buying and using the correct equipment and its requisite maintenance. Systems. Operating systems and information technology resources need to be installed to fulfill the contract. The effective use of these 3 elements and their implementation comprise the mobilization necessary for the execution of the contract. Vendor management. Vendor management is a key process that a successful FM needs to be familiar with and consists of finding, contacting, and establishing and maintaining working relationships with vendors and suppliers outside the company. There are 4 key elements to good vendor management. Choosing the right source. Choose a vendor that is capable of meeting purchase orders at a high standard and a competitive price. Choose a vendor that can handle adverse situations within its own organization and supply chain. Identifying the right source of supply. Think about single source origin, alternative suppliers and competitive rates, product development planning, risk reduction strategies, identifying all of the available or alternative sources, costing, forecasting of costs and events that affect them, price fluctuation and its effects, vendor registration and development. Onboarding a vendor requires registration. Best practice of this involves getting a picture of their business. The vendor should supply you with the supplier's name, office location, warehouse location, factory location, up-to-date performance history, view on and agreement to terms and conditions, as well as quality control and relevant issues around warranty and insurance. Work capacity, staff working history and experience, break-even points, reliability and efficiency, quality assurance, ownership status, any history of problems and their solutions, quality control details. Vendor rating. Take into account the vendor's rating, which is essentially a score given to the vendors based on whether they have fulfilled certain criteria. It is generally calculated by the following: how vendors prioritize quality control in their business, knowledge and understanding of clients' business, quality of vendors' systems for delivering on contracts. How often is the vendor rejected by other bidders, and for what reasons? How effective their planning and techniques are. Research and development plans. Commitment to improvement and optimization. Equipment and tech. Working conditions of staff. Whether they have an ISO 9000 certificate. With this information, an FM should be able to make an informed decision when selecting a vendor. Summary. In this module, you've learned that a lessor is a person or organization that leases or lets a property to another. A lease is a legally binding contract. Before buying a lease, it's important to consider any future spending that might be needed under the terms of the contract. Leaseholders have the right of first refusal from a landlord. Good vendor management requires establishing and taking into account a vendor rating.